Hey, sports card fans, it's John Wade Boggs fan. Hope you're all doing well, and I hope all of you had a happy Thanksgiving. This is a response video to Greg over at Midlife Sports Cards, answering the question that he posed to his audience in his video on Monday. If you haven't checked out that video, I will have a link to that video in the description of this video, so definitely go check it out. Well, what Greg is asking everyone is, do we collect the card or the grade? Now, the answer for me to that has changed over time. When I first started building my vintage collection back in 2020, I was collecting the grade. I thought when I was going to build my collection that I wanted cards that were in decade condition. So in other words, if it was a card from the 70s, I wanted a PSA 7 copy. If it was from the 60s, I wanted a PSA 6 copy, and so on. And that worked well for me initially. I started collecting cards of Hall of Famers, and I started off with the years 1978, 79, and 80. And for most of the cards that I was picking up, I was finding that I could pick up PSA 7s, 8s, sometimes even 9s. The majority of my 1978 cards are either 8s or 9s. But as I started going further back in time, especially for cards from, say, 1970 to 1975, and especially earlier, I quickly found out that cards in a decade grade were getting to be fairly expensive, and I'm on a limited hobby budget. So this was maybe 6 to 9 months into 2020 when I started realizing that some of these cards are going to be fairly expensive for me to buy. And so I had to make a decision for my collection. Did I want a smaller collection of higher graded cards or a much larger collection? And just like my Wade Boggs collection, I'm more of a accumulator. I like a large collection. So I knew I had to make a change because I wanted to stretch my hobby budget. I wanted to buy as many vintage cards as I could. And so initially, I still didn't want to get away from those number grades. And so I thought, okay, well, if I can't afford a card in a decade grade, well, maybe I'll go one step lower. So that worked for a little while, maybe another 3 to 6 months into 2021. And still, I realized for some of the more prominent Hall of Famers in the hobby, even dropping down one number grade for some of those cards were just, they were really expensive and wouldn't allow me with my hobby budget to buy a lot of vintage cards. So again, I made another decision that I was going to move away from the number grade and decide to focus more on the card and finding a card for a particular player that has the nicest eye appeal that fits my particular budget, or how much money I had to spend or wanted to spend for that card at any particular time. And so I started focusing more on the card, and since then that's been my primary focus, is to find cards that have nice eye appeal but for me fit my budget. Now, with that said, I still haven't completely gone away from the number grade. But what I use the number grade for is a guide for me to give a more narrower focus for cards that I'm looking to purchase. So I'll give you an example here. So if I'm looking for a particular card, I'll go on to say VCP, and I'll look that card up, and I will see the historical sales price ranges for different numerical grades. And then for that particular card, I'll say, all right, I'm either can afford right now, or I'm willing to spend, say, like $50 for this card. Well, I'll see which numerical grade that $50 falls into. And let's say it's a PSA 4. So I'll do an eBay search for PSA 4 copies of that card. Maybe a PSA 5. If I can find one on auction, maybe I'll get lucky and be able to pick up a PSA 5 copy for maybe around that $50 price. Maybe willing to go a little bit higher if it's a really nice looking card. Probably wouldn't search for any PSA 3 copies to try to save some money, because in this particular case, once I drop below a PSA 4, the condition, you're more often to find a card with, say, some creasing, which I don't particularly care for. Corners, I don't mind too much, but depending on the card, again, I'm less willing to look for a card that has creases. So in my example here, I'm looking for a PSA 4 that's sort of in my price range. I'll do a search for PSA 4 or maybe PSA 5 copies. And if I'm at a show, so I'm walking around seeing different tables and the display cases. So if I'm looking for a PSA 4, I'm immediately going to ignore any higher grade copies because I know they're going to be too expensive for me. So I do collect the card, but I use the grade, the number grade, as a guide for me to decide which cards I can even start to look at. Then from there, I want to pick the nicest looking card within that price range, right? Now, one other thing I want to mention that's not quite part of Greg's question, but sort of goes to the card and not the grade. And that is, for me, especially cards from, let's say, 1965 and earlier, definitely to the 50s and 40s, and definitely pre-war cards. To me, those cards should look their age. We're talking about cards that are 60, 80, 100 plus years old. And to me, I do these videos of, the top 10 selling cards on eBay videos, and there are some really high grade copies that have sold for 5-digit figures. And I look at some of them and they're like, wow, they're nice looking cards. In fact, I think there was recently, within the last week or two, I think, a 1933 Gaudi Babe Ruth. I think it was in a PSA 8.5 that sold for $1.6 million. I saw a picture of the card online, and it's a gorgeous looking card. But at the same time, it just doesn't look right to me. It looks too good. I'm not saying that anything's wrong with the card was trimmed or anything like that to make it look that nice. I'm pretty sure they would have checked, done all the tests to make sure it was the right size and all that stuff. I'm not saying anything was wrong with it, but to me, the odds of finding a card, and there are some that still exist out there that are maybe 80, 100 years old, that the luck that it's still in that same condition. So whoever owned the card, whether it was one owner, multiple owners, just happened to keep that card basically as it came from the pack. So those are really rare examples. So for me, it should show its age. For cards that old, I expect to have some flaws in the card, and to me, that's what makes the card special. It looks like a 60-year-old card or an 80-year-old card or a 100-year-old card. In fact, my T206 Christy Mathewson has rounded corners, has a few creases in it, but I think it looks gorgeous. It's a SGC 3, but when I saw it, I just fell in love with it. But it looks like a 100-plus-year-old card. It looks like that's what the card should look like, being so old. So that's what I look at. Today I am more buying the card, not the grade. And when I do buy a card, especially the older the card is, I'm looking for copies that, yes, have a general nice eye appeal to them, but I almost want the card to have some sort of flaws to them. And to me, that really makes it a vintage card. Now, the second part of Greg's question is, what do I think the hobby as a whole, or collectors as a whole, collect? Do they collect the card or the grade? Well, I think the majority now, is it 55-45? Is it 60-40? Is it 70-30? I don't know. But I think the majority of the collectors out there collect the card and not the grade. I think the ones out there that collect the grade and not the card are ones that either want to have a smaller collection of cards that are in really nice condition. So they would be looking more toward the number grade of the card, because they want higher grade copies, and maybe with their budget, they can maybe afford maybe one card a year for their collection, and they're okay with that because they want a smaller collection of really nice vintage cards. Then there are the other collectors out there that have much larger hobby budgets than I do, and they can afford higher grade copies. They may not be concerned as much about spreading their hobby dollars, because they have more hobby dollars to spend, and can still, if they wanted to build a larger collection, they could still do that, and at the same time choose higher grade copies of cards to add to their collection. But I think the majority of collectors fall into my category of having a limited budget. Now, some of them may have a smaller budget than me. Some of them may have a slightly larger hobby budget than I do. But I think most of them out there have some limited funds to spend and want a larger collection. So in order to do that, in order to match and not overspend, to fit into your budget and say have a larger collection, you're forced to look at cards that don't have as high of a number grade. And so I think a lot of them choose to look at the card, find a card that has the nicest eye appeal, regardless of what the number says on the slab. The nicest looking card for their budget. Some of them, even look for, depending on the card, will look for authentic copies, because that may be the only way that they can afford that card on their budget. Now, with that said, I think that there's a point that all collectors reach, unless you're, a multi-millionaire or something, can just throw money to cards and not worry what you're spending on them. Even the collectors that I know out there that have a much larger hobby budget than I do, there comes a point with certain cards, and it's probably the older cards, maybe pre-war cards, maybe some of those really top tier Hall of Famers, Ty Cobb, Babe Ruth, things like that. Some of the Gaudy cards, some of the pre-war cards, that just because even in really low grades, the prices are extremely high. So even for them, it may take a while to save up some money to buy a particular card. And I think for them, even though maybe for the majority of vintage cards, they could afford maybe 6s, 7s, 8s for some of these cards, there comes a point where even they would have to say, look, I just want to find a copy that looks decent, that I can afford, and the number grade be damned. I don't care what the number is. I want the card, and I want the nicest card that I can afford, and whatever number on the scale that falls into, whether it's an authentic or a 2 or a 3, even with their larger budget, that may be the range of cards that even they can afford. So I think they turn in those particular cases to looking to buy the card and not the grade. So, it's a mixed bag. For me, like I said, I buy the card, not the grade, but I use the grade as a guide. And I think the majority of collectors out there also collect the card and not the grade. And maybe some of them are like me that use the number grade as more of a guide. So, Greg, another great question that you had for your audience on your video from Monday. And with that, that's all I have for you. So until next time, thanks for watching.